Welcome to the second installment of profiting from the sale of your baseball cards. And today we're going to speculate on the future Hall of Fame inductees. Prior to this, we gave a talk on familiarizing yourself with the Hall of Famers. And following this talk, we'll have a third in the series called The Best Players That Are Not in the Hall of Fame. So the Baseball Writers of Association of America are those who vote on who will or will not be inducted into each year's Hall of Fame. These members earn a Hall of Fame vote from its organization, which is independent of the Hall of Fame, by maintaining 10 consecutive years on a baseball beat. Those Hall of Fame eligible voters are required to complete a registration form and sign a code of conduct. 75% of their vote will determine who is inducted, and there are approximately 400 members of the BBWAA. And you can see in the diagram over here, the 221 Baseball Hall of Fame balloting, where we have the Baseball Hall of Fame and the percent that was accumulated by the various baseball players that were on the ballot of that year. And on the right, we have really the fans' use of that, or basically what they call the baseball roundtable and their kind of conclusions. So that the statistics are important in determining who goes into the Hall of Fame. Those players' awards and analytics, and many of the players who we think or argue that should be in the Hall of Fame, many times their numbers just fall short of greatness. They're very, very good. They have incredible numbers, but they're not enough to make it into the Hall of Fame. So this whole series of numbers that the voters look at, I've talked about in the first presentation on the Hall of Fame, as well as the politics and intangibles that go into the decision. So it's more than just the numbers and the analyticals, but also the personality, the other factors that play into whether a baseball player is going to make it into the Hall of Fame. So this talk is really to kind of not only have fun, but for profit in terms of the one way that card values go up. If that player that one purchased in years past makes the Hall of Fame and the cards demand more money. Now that's a little bit shaky during the period of the card glut or the wax junk wax era. But nonetheless, even those cards are worth more if the player made the Hall of Fame. So that this brings another year, starting in January of 2023, of who will they induct in the Hall of Fame, and trying to guess which players might make it. And that's what we're going to kind of discuss somewhat today. So the first thing is to recognize that on last year's ballot, there are some players who did not make it, and maybe didn't make it by a few votes or many votes, but they'll be included in this year's ballot. So there is a greater chance that they might be chosen on the second ballot, which is usually the case. Not many players are picked in the first ballot. And then that already we know that they've already gotten some votes. And if they get more than 5% of the vote, then they'll be included on a ballot until 10 years have passed. So these are the players that were on last year's ballot and that should be on this year's ballot. And you see many familiar names, but many of them probably have a little chance or none of getting in, primarily, as we know, due to what's occurred over the last 20 or so years with the steroid area or the performance enhancing drugs. So of this group, we can almost eliminate quite a few just because basically they're alleged to be on steroids or know that they're on steroids. And then we'll have others that will be eliminated because they did not have enough years of playtime that really kind of makes them worthwhile to be in the Hall of Fame. And so you'll basically have maybe out of this group about 4 players that will be possible to get in, but remember the second ballot. And one of them that many people who kind of follow this and consistently kind of choose those that probably will make it in. Probably one person here is Billy Wagner. There's a good chance that Scott Rowland will get in, and possibly Omar Vizquel. Todd Helton is kind of borderline, but it's always a possibility. Okay. And there are others that are under the radar that, they did not get a whole lot of votes in the last time, but still they have some qualifications that make them possibilities. Certainly Ryan Howard, as well as Tim Lincecum, and so have a lot of things to their credit and Joe Nathan, and as well as Tim Hudson and Bob Abro. Now, there's another vote that goes in for people who in the past have not made it into the Hall of Fame during their eligibility. And that committee that chooses this was first met in 1953, and it was called the Veterans Committee. And now that name has been changed to the ERA Committee. And basically what this committee does is they consider Major League Baseball players no longer eligible for election by the Baseball Writers Association of America. So this is kind of a after the fact vote that some players kind of enter in. In fact, as we'll see, quite a few historically have entered in through this route. Of the 179 of the 340 players that are currently in the Hall of Fame, 105 come from this committee. 33 of those that are voted in are executives, 22 that have been voted in this committee are managers, and 10 have been umpires. So a lot of people do make it through this route. It just takes a longer time to get in there. So this ERA or ERA committee is broken down into two classifications. One of those is called the contemporary era, that is 1980 to present. And these are the players that have had the greatest impact of the game, but it also includes voting in those managers, executives, and umpires. The second category is the classic era before 1980. These are the old timers or legends, and also include the inductees from the Negro League. So you'll see of the players that were inducted last year, 2022, you'll see that the ERA committee was very busy because we have kind of representatives from both of these groups. We have the old timers like Gil Hodges, and before 1980, even Jim Cott and Tony Oliva, and as well as Minnie Minoso. But then you have the Negro League players like Bud Farrow, and you also have Buck O'Neill. And so these players have gotten in now, and we're not in the regular balloting, but basically the post balloting, which is the ERA committee. Contemporary era baseball ballots. These are broken into two things. That is the Hall of Stats and the Hall of Merit. So these are the players that are considered by those individuals who kind of keep records and track and so forth in terms of the statistics that have the greatest potential, perhaps, of being voted by that veterans or so committee to get in. Unfortunately, as we said, and we'll keep saying throughout these talks, when we talk about the Hall of Fame, you're going to have several that will immediately be disqualified due to the attitude against steroids and performance enhancing drugs. So we can immediately kind of eliminate those players. And then you have another player who actually got a lot of a percent of the vote, but unfortunately they feel he will not make it because of his difficulty with teammates, as well as his vocalization of his politics and so forth, that being Curt Schilling. And then there are other players that basically probably don't have the stats that fit those criteria we talked about earlier, that will be eliminated. And now you have left in this a group that, again, those people who follow it, people who kind of write on it and so forth, do YouTubes and so forth, it's kind of consistent on these players that have the best chance, perhaps in the future, to be elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame. And then you have Clark, and the issue with Will Clark is kind of confusing. So he has a lot of good stats, but they're good stats, or very good stats, but they're not great stats. And some people even consider that his career wasn't as long as it should have been or could have been, though it was 15 years. So it's an enigma why someone who has a reputation and the following of Will Clark is not in the Hall of Fame. But there are those who will argue for and against it, and it's always a possibility. Now you have the ERA committee, and this is more difficult for me to even speculate who is eligible and who is worthy and so forth. But these are the names that keep cropping up. One is Bob Dalen. Another one is Jim McCormick, and from the Negro League, you've got John Donaldson. So these are kind of good bets that they will, if not this year, but soon, be nominated and also elected into the Baseball Hall of Fame through the ERA committee. Now, here are new candidates that will be coming up, and this class is basically been kind of given some points prior to it in terms of their potential, have Hall rating values of 20 plus for the 200 2023 induction. And some of the players that may be familiar to you, they have been around. You probably have to do some homework to look at their stats and compare them to what we say they're kind of looking for as kind of watermark levels to get to. But the ones that again, experts seem to think that have the best chance are those here at the top with Carlos Beltran, Jared Weaver. You also have Jason Worth, and you have Ellsbury, and you have John Lackey. All of those seem to have good potential to possibly make it into the Hall of the new eligible players that will be on the ballot. Okay. Well, what's interesting is kind of looking back historically, if you were just collecting and trying to predict who would make the Hall of Fame, one thing you might think of as you're following young players is, well, they're good, and their first year they were awarded the Rookie of the Year, and so therefore they have great potential eventually, in 15 or 20 years later, to make the Hall of Fame. Well, surprisingly, that's not the case. Of all the Hall of Famers that have been elected into this prestigious group, only 17 of the Rookie of the Years have made the Hall of Fame. In fact, it's the least predictive of those markers for future greatness. But these are those 17 players that were Rookies of the Year and also made it into the Hall of Fame. And then interesting about this is that if you were kind of collecting and hoping that there might be an eventual kind of profit that earned from the players' productivity and value, you would kind of see that most of these players, they started out in terms of their first card available, started out expensive and continued to maintain that gradual rise. So it wasn't like they're a surprise and you could buy their card later and make a fortune. Most of these players, basically, there was a kind of awareness about them before it really happened, but not maybe so much for Mike Piazza, and maybe even a little bit surprising in terms of Jeff Bagwell in this group. But then to fill out that 17, you see a lot of familiar names and faces in this group that certainly would deserve the Hall of Fame, and also they happen to be Rookie of the Year. But there also are 150 players who have won the Rookie of the Year since 1947. They were solid players. They could not maintain those lofty statistics that got them the award, or even add any accolades to their career, MVP, all-star teams, enough to basically garner the votes they needed to get into the Hall. So we can look at another area of awards, which is most valuable player, and see how many of those made the Hall of Fame. Well, you can get more than one MVP, and so it turns out there are 7 players in the Hall of Fame with 3 MVPs, and there's one that didn't make it in with 3 MVPs. So the ones that made it in with these MVPs were Yogi Berra, Roy Campanella, Mickey Mantle, Stan Musial, Lou Gehrig, as well as Mike Schmidt, and also Jimmy Fox. So they had 3 MVPs, and the one that didn't, as we kind of are becoming more and more familiar with this name, is Barry Bonds. And it's, of course, questionable with his background in terms of PEDs, whether he will ever enter into it. And then we have those individuals who are eligible and soon to be eligible. We'll find out, because we know that A-Rod is alleged to have used them, and will he make it into the Hall of Fame? But he had 3 MVPs. And then we look at those players in the Hall of Fame that had 2 Most Valuable Player awards: Robin Yount, Ernie Banks, Joe Morgan, Johnny Bench, Willie Mays, Frank Robinson, Ted Williams, as well as Hank Greenberg, Carl Hubble, Al Newshouser, Cal Ripken, and Frank Thomas. So all of those had 2 MVPs. And then there are 3 who got 2 MVPs that did not make the Hall of Fame. We're actually going to go over one of these in great detail, but the 2 that you may or may not know of are Roger Maris and Dale Murphy, who have not made the Hall of Fame. And there are reasons for that in terms of the longevity of their careers, the consistency in their careers, the last few years of their career, et cetera, et cetera. So there are 42 players in the Hall of Fame who have won MVP award, and there actually are 47 players who have 1 MVP award that never made the Hall of Fame. So it's kind of a 50-50 thing in terms of if you're tracking a player and they got an MVP, whether or not they'll eventually make the Hall of Fame. And then surprisingly, we have 3 players that got MVPs that didn't even ever make it to the ballot, and this would be Jim Castandy, Al Rosen, and Zolio Versailles back in 1965 on the Twins. And so the MVP is no guarantee, and even multiple is no guarantee that you're going to make it into the Hall of Fame. Now, there are now this year, in terms of the eligibility and active list, there are numerous players that are on the list that have received an MVP award. And at the top, you'll see all the players that are not eligible yet, but they soon will be after their 5 years passes. And one of the ones that probably has a very good chance, according to the prognosticators, is Suzuki. And then there's some questions about Jason Moreau, probably not Ryan Braun because of the incidents with steroids. Posey, Ryan Howard is kind of on that borderline list. We already talked about Jimmy Collins and him. And certainly when these other players that are active become eligible, there's many in there that have real potential, if not the Clayton Kershaws or the Verlanders or any of these players have really good potential in terms of getting the Joey Vottos and so forth. Mookie Betts, who knows about Freddie Freeman or Chris Bryant, but these are the ones that have received MVPs and will be coming up eventually to be eligible to be put on the ballot. Okay, now players with more than 400 home runs not in the Hall of Fame. So usually we kind of look at this kind of 500 home runs and you're in, but you'll see at the top where those players are listed, there are many that, at least in the near future, probably are not going to make it. And so you can kind of almost eliminate that group. But we have two coming up that should have a shoo-in for getting it because they are in that 500 home run club, and that being Albert Pujols and Miguel Cabrera. And then you have a group that has more than 400, and you have some potential, especially in those ones who don't have a history of PED. And then we're going to look at these Major League Baseball players with over 3,000 hits in their career. All of them are in the Hall of Fame, so I'm not going to list all of them, but there are actually several that didn't make it. And the reason always seems to be that either they're not eligible yet, or they are alleged to be on PEDs, or in the case of the most successful hitter of all time, Pete Rose, the gambling issue. So you got Pete Rose and Rafael Palmeiro, and you've got coming up, you've got Alex Rodriguez and Adrian Beltre, and now you've got two other people who have real potential to make it. Just like I said, they are in the 500 home run club, as well as the 3,000 hits club. A good kind of rule of thumb is that your potential is significantly increased if you have 2,000 hits or more. So there are many in that club, but not, of course, all of those are going to be shoo-ins for the Hall of Fame. Now we look at the other side of the equation, from the hitters now to the pitchers, and we look at the Cy Young winners who are in the Hall of Fame. So there is a kind of elite group that actually has 3 Cy Youngs. Okay, so the Randy Johnsons, Greg Maddux, Pedro Martinez, Sandy Koufax, and Steve Carlton, Tom Seaver, and Jim Palmer all have 3, and of course all are in the Hall of Fame. There is one who has 3 Cy Young awards, and the question about whether he will make it anytime soon because of allegations of performance-enhancing drugs. And then we have those individuals who have 2 Cy Young awards: the Tom Glavines, the Roy Halladay's, the Gaylord Perrys, and the Bob Gibson. And then you have those who are non-Hall of Fame who have 2 Cy Young awards, and that being Brett Saberhagen, Denny McClain, and Johan Santana. Now, there are people who argue Johan Santana should be in. They'll even compare him at some statistics with Sandy Koufax, but others feel that he just doesn't have all the statistics he needs to make it. Brett Saberhagen is a good chance that eventually, maybe, of course, he has to go to the Veterans Committee to get in, but there's a possibility there. There actually have been 35 pitchers who have thrown multiple no-hitters. And there are 2 Cy Young eligible that are still active. They've won 2 Cy Youngs. Those are the Lissicum and the Verlanders and the Jacob deGrom, as well as Kluber. Then we have the pitchers who are in the Hall of Fame, who have the 1 Cy Young, and the group is listed here, many of them familiar faces in that group. And then we have there are 35 Cy Young Award winners that are not in the Hall of Fame. So again, it's not a shoo-in, it's not automatic. If you get the Cy Young Award, probably a better chance if you win 2 or 3, but even that's not a shoo-in all the time if you've been using the drugs. And then we have 3 players that have won the Cy Young that were never even put on the ballot, that being Mike McCormick, Dean Chance, and Bob Turley. So now we're looking at those who pitched 2 or more no-hit games. And we've got uh, Warren Spahn, Jim Bunning, we have Roy Halladay and Randy Johnson, who pitched 2 no-hitters. And then we have Bob Feller and Jeremy Justin Verlander, who pitched 3. And then you have Sandy Koufax, who had 4 no-hit games. And we've got Nolan Ryan, which is way out in the stratosphere, having 7 no-hit games. And all these individuals, of course, made the Hall of Fame. And then you have those who are not in the Hall of Fame, who have basically pitched 2 or more no-hit games. And you see this list here. And some of them, are going to have to enter if they do through the veterans loop. But you have others that basically may be coming up soon for a possibility once they become active. And everybody is kind of banking on Max Scherzer and probably even Jake Arrieta as making that group. The others have a possible chance. And again, you're speculating. You can kind of think about, well, should I invest in this card or have those cards, put them aside, make sure that as soon as the voting's out, that I get them available for sale, or however you speculate will make the most profit for you. So players eligible for Hall of Fame ballot over the next several years. So now we're kind of projecting, maybe not this year, but let's keep abreast and keep watching these players the people who kind of track these types of things think they're a good bet. So we have those eligible to be in the ballot, not this year, but in 2024. And you've got Adrian Beltran, and you got Joe Mauer, and you have Chase Utley, Alberto Colon. You also have other players like Jose Bautista and Victor Martinez, Jose Reyes, and Brandon Phillips. All of these will be eligible. Now, then you have to kind of do your homework, look at their stats, and see how favorable they will and what are the chances. And a lot of players are not going to make it on the first ballot, but they get pretty high, so they'll make it the second or third ballot, which is, what you have to bank on. Now, those eligible to be on the ballot in 2025, some familiar names are CC Sabathia and Yoshiro Suzuki. And then you see some other names that are familiar, but maybe not have the stats to basically make it into the Hall. Dustin Pedroia, Curtis Granderson, Ian Kinsler, Brian McCann, Carlos Gonzalez, Melky Cabrera, as well as David Freese. But probably betting man might go for Sabathia or Yoshiro Suzuki. But again, this is a wait and see, but gives you some hedge in terms of where can I go with these players. Eligible to be on the ballot in 2006. Now we're just moving behind, but kind of watching these players in terms of the kind of end of their careers, or so to speak, and what's going to happen. And you will recognize some of these players' names from the past. A lot of them have slowed down, so you kind of got to be leery, as we talked about, in terms of what are the criteria. If you have a slump those last 2 to 5 years, it doesn't help your case for being elected to the Hall. And if they're in a slump, they're probably not going to get those numbers up high enough to go from very, very good to greatness. Again, moving even further, more of a projection, but eligible for the ballot in 2027. And Buster Posey seems to have a really good chance. And then you can see the other players. There's Jake Arrieta as well as John Lester. They're in the group. So current players who have potential for being inducted into the Hall of Fame. So these we would call, a good gamble. There may even some have gone as far as say there are no brainers. In other words, they'll be in, if it's not the first ballot, it'll be the second ballot. So, and really a lot of them were kind of, earmarked the day that they basically came into the league and that first year was over. So you have the Albert Pujols and you have the Miguel Cabreras, as well as the Justin Verlanders, certainly Mike Trout, Max Scherzer, Clayton Kershaw. And they've even gone on a limb to say kind of the newbies like Juan Soto and Shohei Ohtani, are shoo-ins. That's kind of, to me, going on a ledge. They could get injured. So many things could happen, but they still feel confident. They have shown such good promise in these early years that it will continue during their careers. Then you have not an absolute lock, but should eventually get there. So now you see some players that you may have tracked when they were younger, and continue to track. If they continue to produce, then they really should have an excellent chance of making the Hall. But anything can happen, injuries, shortened careers, and so forth. So just gotta kind of keep on tracking them and tracking their numbers and their analytics. Now we have borderline, guys who will eventually get in. but not a sure thing. You would think that Aaron Judge would, but you probably should look up some of the arguments pro or against him in terms of making it just because you're popular and you have a middle segment. He came in the year later, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to make the case for him not getting it. I think he's a great player and would not be upset if he made it. But then you have other players that are familiar to you, and even putting one of the newbies in there, Vladimir Guerrero Jr. Is a speculation, but they seem to be, he's shown enough that unless he gets injured or cuts his career short, he should be real have potential. And then these are the players, like so many players that people argue should be in the Hall of Fame. They're really, really good, but they're not Hall of Fame material. So you could probably look at any of them and you have a memory of their performance or watching them for a few years, or they did real well during this span. But again, you got to look at their whole careers and you got to take all those numbers together. If they're batters, their batting average, their home runs, their RBIs, their on-base percentage, all those things into account, and the pitchers in terms of win-loss records and strikeouts and ERAs and all like that. But again, it's always a possibility in terms of those players. And then there's many that are just entered the league in the last this year and then been in the league maybe even 2 or 3 years that are showing real good likelihood that they'll be possible candidates, but it's not a sure thing. It's just too early to tell. And you can kind of look at that group and kind of keep them on the back burner and continue to watch them. And maybe, in about 10 to 20 years, your projections would be correct. And others, you'll be surprised that, wow, I was so sure that they would make it and it never happened. And so this kind of gives you an overview of what it takes to get in the Hall of Fame, kind of the politics in terms of determining who gets in, who doesn't, all looking at the stats, especially which ones seem to be that threshold level, which will get you over and get you assuredly to get into the Hall. What other people who track these things, what they consider, who's on the ballot, who's not on the ballot, and how many votes you need, and so forth and so on. So if you are interested in learning additional information about the baseball card industry, the history of baseball cards, profiting and investing in baseball cards, or ideas to bring the fun back to collecting, be sure to follow us below. Feel free to view our library of YouTube videos, and please take a moment to hit the subscribe button. Also, check out our eBay store, where we have available for sale many of the cards shown in these videos.